Alright, so this is my problem with the Libertarian Party, at least in the United States. So, I do consider myself a libertarian, but not like the typical libertarian as you would see in the US. Why? I mean, that's kind of why I'm going to be, what I'm going to be discussing. Now, I still pretty much believe in the basic principles of libertarianism. Some of the, some of the ways they go about it, like some in the policies they espouse to achieve that, I really disagree with, and I disagree with them significantly so. Because also, what you have is also, there's multiple different schools of libertarianism. There's libertarian socialism, which I actually agree with more, I think, to some extent than a decent amount, a lot more than the US Libertarian Party. And in that vein, I would go, I'm not going to call myself a libertarian socialist, but I will call myself a social libertarian. Because I think that in sort of the more, in my opinion, that's more of a moderate name. Social libertarian. Typically that's like, you're not a socialist, you're just agree with certain aspects of it. And then you're gonna go for generally libertarian personal freedom and a decent amount of economic freedom, you know, but not crazy economic freedom, you know. So enough economic freedom to where, you know, there's still enough incentive to go above and beyond. But, you know, growing up, even at a conservative school, there was a time and place where we just stopped counting score, you know. A very conservative school, practically, I'm pretty sure, I'm fair to say every single person was a Republican in that school. Pretty much. There probably might have been a few Democrats, but pretty sure, especially pre-Trump, this was probably like the Obama Bush era Republicans. I mean, pretty sure most, if not all, were Republican. Okay? Yeah. At a certain point, we called it, okay, there's no need to keep score, that's just bragging. Alright. Now, of course, with games, if you're trying to win the game, and then the game's over, you call it. When the game's over, someone wins. Alright. Now, when it comes to the game of life, things are different. Life is ever onward. There's not an end point. The end point is you die. And everyone else's life begins. So, with life is more of a perpetual game. And so it comes to the point where you have to ask yourself, at what point is some people winning so much to where it's obscene how ahead they are? Where it is obscene. Where that line is, again, I think is good, but that's to some extent some of my things. Now, as to the more I think libertarians get everything right is in their skepticalness towards the government. Because, I mean, that's the one thing I mean, liberals cannot stand Ben Shapiro. I mean, they just can't stand him. They'll agree with him on free speech stuff, but rightfully, and also on the snowflake stuff, but rightfully point out his hypocrisy on the snowflakes and facts don't care about your feelings bullshit when it doesn't go the same way. When liberals have the facts on their side and Ben Shapiro appeals to people's feelings, you know? That's the kind of shit that they... But when it comes to the issue of the Second Amendment and guns, liberals, I think, kind of lose their shit. They use feelings, not facts. I agree with Ben Shapiro when he says we should use facts, not feelings, okay? And let me tell you, I probably disagree with Ben Shapiro on like about 80% of things. You could fairly say that I'm left. But when it comes to the Second Amendment, Ben Shapiro, have you seen Piers Morgan interview Ben Shapiro? He just aces it. I would say I completely agree with Ben Shapiro 100%. And Piers Morgan is pretty much looking like an idiot in that interview. And I'm a lefty. I'm a liberal leftist. That Ben Shapiro just goes, liberal lefties. And no, yeah, I mean, I completely agree with him on that. But also, Ben, I don't know if you noticed, but I don't know how I look in this, because to me, as I'm speaking, I seem normal to myself, but when I look back on some of my videos, even though I seem normal to myself, it's like I look back and I see myself as kind of like a retard. So, Ben, I would consider that a fairly reasonable response, but Ben, I would say to you, you kind of have a little bit of an annoying voice, you know. I mean, just food for thought. I mean, Jake Tapper does as well. I can't stand, it's that nasally. I don't know if, to some extent, I think I have a little bit of a nasal. And whenever that happens to me, gosh, even when it happens to me, I can't stand it. I think it sounds so terrible. I think nasalness, some ways, now some voices it doesn't impact as much, and so it's not as bad. I think my voice is, to some extent, is one of those where it's not like that. I think that's partially maybe a bit of my southern accent, which kind of, well, I don't have too much of a southern accent, but to what extent I do, that softens the annoyingness of my voice. But yeah, I mean, but yeah, especially when I'm sick, it sounds pretty fucking annoying to myself. Yeah, but yeah. Even Ben Shapiro. I think Ben Shapiro's aced it. The main reason Ben Shapiro aced this is because he said, oh yeah, there are some definitely reasonable regulations that we should put in place, like background checks, extremely high background checks. Unfortunately, the NRA has been taking an all or nothing stance on reasonable issues. When there is a reasonable discussion to be had, they close the door off. Now, I get a decent amount of what some of these lefties want is, in my opinion, unreasonable. Assault weapons ban, unreasonable. Now, assault weapons restrictions, I'd be open to it. Like, let's say, military training. You need military training in order to possess an assault, in order to possess the assault weapon, or the mechanics involved in the assault weapon, let's say. I'd be open to that if you say certain training involved in acquiring a certain type of weapon, that I'm open to. But banning outright, no, not one bit. So yeah, I think I do, and background checks, I do think we need to have, to some extent, universal background checks, federal, and also, to some extent, I think we need to impose like what is it? A local rights law. Basically, it would say, it would essentially give cities, it basically give local authorities more say in their gun laws. So let's say Chicago wants to ban a certain guns or whatever, a certain type of gun from their streets. The state of Illinois could say, sure. The state of Illinois says, okay, that's fine in Chicago, but the other places, we're gonna let Illinois do that because, you know, state trumps city always. And so then the people in the rural Illinois decide, okay, but we're still gonna allow those guns. End up, what I think would be a good regulation is to say, okay, if you go into rural Illinois where that gun is legal, you have a background check where your ID scans and it has an address of the guns you were legally allowed to purchase for the address that you have, for all the laws that pertain to what guns and what things you are legally allowed to have, for the address on your ID that you give to them for them to run the background check. If you want to get something that is not allowed in that area where your unlicensed address is, the onus would then be on you to provide a proof of a secondary residence where you would keep your guns, and you would be required by law to swear to only keep those guns at your secondary address where those guns are legally allowed. That's a proposed solution. So one, we can actually see how the laws work and see how, one, I think we could have more honest discussion on gun laws to see what works and what doesn't work, and what's a good balance between rights and security. Because ultimately, I do agree that the best defense against tyranny is weapons, is a well-armed populace. Now, more so against our own government than foreign invaders, because in the modern age, people are more likely to get nuked than to send a land invasion, than to send troops and bombs and shit, than to send troops as a full-scale invasion. They'll just bomb you, you surrender, then they send the troops, and when it's safe. So the most likely place would be against your own government, because the best place would be to do it in the capital, because they're not going to nuke themselves. They're just not going to. Now, if the capital's in like California, and the elites are over and the government's over in Washington, D.C., hell, we nuked New Mexico to test this shit. You think we're not going, though, depending on how powerful our nuclear missiles are, even they might be worried about doing that. So yeah, the likelihood of using an actual nuclear missile or some crazy super weapon on our own people is less likely. So we stand a better chance when armed to defeat our government versus any other country. But of course, only to be used in the most drastic of circumstances. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. When you deny me my First Amendment rights, I default to my second. The idea that no government will ever go tyrannical is utterly insane. And then, of course, this is a brain puke because I'm going on tangents. Now to get back to my tip as why I'm against some libertarian, why I'm critical of the current libertarian party in the US. Because that spiel was me acknowledging, yeah, government is tyrannical, it's been tyrannical, it's the likelihood of it being tyrannical, if you don't think it already is tyrannical, today with Trump in office, and all these elites and the moneyed interests and everything. But yeah, governments can be tyrannical, but so can private institutions, or as I call them, private governments. More so with private governments because they're unelected to any extent. They have no accountability whatsoever to the consumer. Sure. I mean, the likelihood of you actually gaining some change with a private corporation through a boycott isn't super likely. I mean, come on. Especially because really, the main things you can actually get a corporation to do are to not advertise in certain places, because that's places that these corporations are actually paying other people. So if you're mad at them for spending money at a certain place, to some extent, they're gonna go, okay, we won't give them any more money for them to advertise us. That's fine. They're more likely to do that because that's money they don't have to pay someone else. Versus an actual greedy practice they're doing. They're not going to change it. I mean, just look at people have been talking about boycotting a bunch of places because, they treat their workers terribly in overseas and like some third world country where they exploit dirt poor wages. They're still doing just fine. People are still buying their products just as fervently as ever. Might be a few thousand people who don't partake, but generally the population is apathetic. I probably would count myself among that bunch because, it's virtually everything. Virtually everything. You would have to pretty much be a hermit living out in the woods to avoid this sort of shit. So private entities, to a decent extent, are unaccountable on how they make their money. The only accountability they get is by the government. So basically, you have to balance the two. You have to go a balance between, hey, you're out of line. Oh yeah, government, then you're out of line. There's got to be a balance. Otherwise, because government can get out of control, so can moneyed interests. I mean, everything, money, power, it's all corruptible. Particular, in my opinion, this is where I kind of agree a lot with social libertarianism or libertarian socialism, is because they believe in basically a lot of decentralization. Libertarianism is really all about decentralization. Now, to some extent, it can be bad. I have seen it being bad in like banking situation where it was so decentralized that I can't remember anything, but a bank wasn't big enough to handle certain costs when it went under, and a bunch of banks went under, and so yeah, so decentralization isn't perfect also. So I do think so yeah, I do acknowledge that there's a lot of decentralization issues, so I would think, but I do think we should at least maximize decentralization and then have a minimal but great authority within the central authority. I say minimally great because their authority is minimal, but to that minimal extent they have the authority, they have a large amount of it. So they have the authority to just boom, but great. So where when it is deemed necessary, when, I don't know, maybe 2/3 majority or so, whatever. But when something gets out of line, when there's a decision that needs to be corrected from above, they have the authority to do it. So forth and everything, but other than that, everything is pretty much decentralized. And the central authority is just to make up, it's pretty weak, because strong, as weak as possible, because one's central authorities cannot really function if they're not a decent amount strong. We learned that with the Articles of Confederation. And again, it can't be so strong that it infringes upon the rights of the people. And then, of course, also, if decentralized, also if like even local authorities, if given enough power, can infringe upon the rights of the people. So it's all a bunch of balancing acts. And I think in many ways the US Constitution does a great job of this. And I've got some ideas that if I think if properly fleshed out with a lawyer, I'm not a lawyer yet, I'm thinking about going to law school, but yeah, with some other good minds, if we come together, I think we can put this country back on the path of the original founders with enough alterations to the original to where we can get them their vision with the full inclusion that it should have, not their exclusive freedom and liberty for only white men, no, for women, minorities, other religions, etc. Especially atheism, though. I do think we should, to some extent, at least, I don't think it should be done through the state, but I do think there should be kind of a social movement where we really disincentivize faith, where faith is no longer considered a virtue and so forth, because it really isn't. I mean, oh yay, I believe something without evidence, I'm virtuous. No, you're not. You're not fucking virtuous. Not in the slightest. You should have the right to it, but I shouldn't. But I should be expected to respect your right to believe your religion and your right to believe in some political philosophy, but I have no obligation to respect your religion by virtue of it being your religion. I should only respect your right to believe in that religion. You know, common sense. So yeah, that's one of our major gripes with libertarianism, at least in the United States. It doesn't adequately account for the failings of the free market and the private governments that try their damnedest to do hidden fees, markups, overprice, which is an essentially technical, and because they talk about tax as theft. Profit is technically a tax. Profit is technically because under that principle, yeah, profit is technically theft. Under that extreme libertarian principle, the concept of profit, which I know they wouldn't agree with it technically is a tax. It's a tax on the private government, which is the company, the corporation, the business, whatever, is taxing you because they need money to sustain themselves for providing the service, which is the same thing that the government does. They tax you for their sustenance for providing this service. It's ultimately the main difference between private and public is that public you elect, private it just is, yeah, it's private. So yeah, I think we need to have Keynesian, a mix of both, the best of both worlds, but not like half measures. No, if you're gonna do something, you do it. If you're gonna commit to if you're gonna, like Obamacare, that was a half measure. I mean, if you're gonna compromise in a good way. Do a compromise that actually makes sense. Don't do a half measure that just soothes both just as a good political move. So, we can say we didn't decrease the spending, or we got an increase in our particular political spending, and you got your increase in your political spending. It's like, Grandpa, we just increased spending. Why not go the other way, you know? I mean, to some extent we might, of course I do think we need to adequately fund these things, and the military is overfunded to the point where it's at money they don't need, to where they're just wasting money, literally. And I do think we need to increase efficiency, but yeah, increase spending when it's needed, where it's needed. And if you're seeing that, and you use your judgment to whether the things were actually needed, you know, or whether it's just we need more funding so we have a comfortable, in case we need more fund, so we're not so tight with the budget. Because I think that's a natural concern, but also the point is so we can give that money to someplace else that needs it. So, you know, we need balances, and we need to cut things that maybe we might not want to cut. Foreign aid, I think, would be foreign aid and military budget. That's like the first two things I'd cut. I mean, yeah, it's gonna hurt. I do think the downside is it hurt our soft power, but maybe not all the countries, but some countries that I don't think we're gonna have any soft power impact in, I think would be fine to cut. So yeah, bit of my political philosophy. Plus some objections libertarian to at least the US libertarianism, because I've got my own form of libertarianism So yeah, that's it from me.